Hello, I'm Michael Ruger. I'm the managing partner at Greenbush Financial Group, and today we're going to be discussing, should you consider putting your house in a trust? We actually have this conversation a lot with our financial planning clients, and most people think as soon as they hear the word trust, that's just for the uber wealthy. My last name isn't Rockefeller, so I'm never going to need a trust, but that's actually not true. Trusts have a lot of benefits that average families, average individuals should really consider accessing for events down the road. But I'll first start off in the most simple for people that aren't familiar with trust. What is a trust? Like, a trust is essentially you're setting up a third party, a fictitious third party, to own your assets. Sometimes that third party even has its own social security number, which is called a tax ID number. So just like we're setting it up, and I'll go through why you would do that and what the benefits are. So there's really two types of trusts, and this is very important. There's revocable trusts, and then there's irrevocable trusts. So the main difference between the two is revocable trusts give you more flexibility because you're not really giving the asset away. You can always take that asset back. Versus an irrevocable trust, as the name suggests, you're making an irrevocable, non-reversible gift to this trust that you're not supposed to be able to take back to you. And each trust has different types of benefits that we'll be discussing today. So let's first start with a revocable trust. This is the most flexible one. Now, revocable trust, why would you want to set one up? The primary reason people set up these trusts is to avoid probate. Now, if anyone's ever had a family member or friend pass away and you've been the executor of their estate, you realize that probate is a huge headache. There's a lot of costs. There's a ton of paperwork. So to avoid that, any asset that's owned by a trust, there is no probate. Because when you go through the probate process, just like you got to pay attorneys, you got to pay accountants, you might have to pay an appraiser. It's a court-driven process, so you got to deal with the courts. So if I own my house and I just wanted to go to my kids, essentially, if it's just in my will and I will it to them, that's going to go through the probate process. So my kids might not take ownership of that house for 6 to 12 months while it's going through the probate process. Versus if I have a revocable trust on the house, my kids can take immediate access to that thing as soon as they look at the trust document and say, oh, it belongs to the kids. There's no probate issue. Here you go. And it saves all the costs that you would have had to go through during the probate process. So a big benefit there. The other reason why people set up these revocable trusts is they have kids under the age of 25. So when you have younger children, if we have, a house, we have retirement accounts, we have insurance, if God forbid something happens to me and my wife simultaneously and we have young children, what essentially happens is those assets get set aside for the kids, but then when they turn 18, they have full access, which means they could come into large sums of money and they might not make the best financial decisions at the age of 18. They might decide not to go to college, or they may make some questionable life choices because they're just flush with cash. Now, to prevent that, what people will do is set up these revocable trusts to say, if in that instance that happens, where something happens to both parents, that says all the money goes into this trust, but then it's only going to get released in accordance with the language in the trust document. So I might say in my trust document, if that happens, money can always be spent for education, health, normal living expenses, but the principal of that trust will not be released until they get a third at 25, a third at age 30, and a third at age 35. You can set these up however you want. They're completely custom and everyone has different wishes. But just knowing it's a way to kind of control those assets if you have younger children in the family. So that's really revocable trust. So let's kind of shift gears over to the irrevocable trust. Now this is the trust where you're giving assets. So why would someone subject themselves to more restrictions? Now, the two and revocable trusts have all the benefits of an irrevocable trust. So you avoid probate, you can control it for younger children, but it has two added benefits. So the one benefit is it protects assets from a long-term care event. And the other one is it shrinks your estate. Now, shrinking your estate, that is for the uber wealthy that say, hey, I've got a $20 million estate and I'm going to have a huge estate tax. So if I give money to this trust, I'm essentially removing it and shrinking my estate. Now, since most of us don't have that issue, really it's the first one that kind of says, I want to protect assets from a long-term care event. Now, again, if you've ever had a family member that's had a long-term care event, whether they've needed home health aides, they've been in a nursing home, assisted living, you know that care is very, very, very expensive. And the way the system works now is you're essentially required to spend through almost all your assets, and then when you're well below the poverty level, then Medicaid will start paying for your care on your own. Now, with some advanced planning using an irrevocable trust, you can protect a lot of your assets that should that long-term care event happen down the road, you don't have to spend down all of your assets. So that's like, I always ask clients, you've worked so hard to build these retirement accounts, pay off your house and everything. Do you want those assets to go to your kids or your beneficiaries, or do you want it to go towards your care or Medicaid when they take it down the road if there's a long-term care event? And most people say, I want it to go to my kids. Well, this is a way with a little bit of advanced planning, you can ensure that those assets do. Because the way Medicaid works is, if you have a long-term care event, they have what's called a 5-year look-back period. So they look back 5 years to say if you gifted any of your assets away, if you gifted it to a trust, an individual, anything, it's back on the table like it never happened. Because what Medicaid does not want to have happen is you have a long-term care event and then you gift all your assets to a trust and say, hey, I qualify for Medicaid, start paying for me. That's not what it's set up to do. The reason why there is that advanced planning is if you want to do this, you have to put these assets in the irrevocable trust. It has to make it by the 5-year look-back period. Once you're past the 5 years, if there's a long-term care event, they can't look at those assets as a spend down because they haven't been yours for more than 5 years. Now, people say, well, I've heard your house with Medicaid, they can't make you sell it. It's not a countable asset. To an extent that is accurate, that it's not a countable asset. If all you own is your house and you've spent through all of your other assets, you will qualify for Medicaid. However, what people do not realize is Medicaid puts a lien against that house. While they can't make you sell it while you're still living, they put a lien against it that says, listen, if we paid out $150,000 for you for your long-term care, when you pass, we're going to make you sell that house and we're going to recoup that money. So again, in the situation saying, I want my house to go to the kids, people don't realize that, you didn't have to sell it, you qualify for Medicaid, but Medicaid is waiting to take that house as soon as you pass. If you have the house owned by an irrevocable trust and it's been in there for 5 years, they can't touch it. It's going to go to your kids, which is usually a more ideal situation. So when you look at that, for the amount it may cost to set up a trust, if an attorney charges you $2 or $3 grand, which sounds like a lot of money, well, how much is it for your house, the value of your house, to make sure it's passing to your kids or to protect assets against a long-term care event, which is very expensive. I mean, it's not uncommon for nursing homes to cost upward of $120,000 plus per year. So again, a little advanced planning going a long ways. Now, I do get some questions, and these kind of came in from our blog and the website that I did want to go over, so that were very good questions. So when you give your house to a trust, the question was, okay, I have a star exemption or I have an enhanced star which reduced my property taxes. Do I still receive that if the house is owned by an irrevocable or irrevocable trust? The answer is yes. So usually the estate attorney will put enough language in there that says any of the tax benefits you were getting as an individual will pass through to the trust even though it's owned there. The other question that was a good one is, if my house is gifted to a trust, do my beneficiaries still receive a step-up in basis? Because if you own assets as an individual, so if I buy my house for $20,000 40 years ago, but now it's worth $250,000, when I pass, if it's owned by an individual, you get a step-up in basis, which means when my beneficiaries get the house, they pay no tax on that. It's the same thing where if the attorney is putting the right language in the trust document, you should still be able to maintain that step up in basis so your beneficiaries don't have to pay tax on the gain, which is a big deal because a lot of people have owned their house for a long time have that gain built up in their primary residence. Here's the other big one. So if I sell my primary residence while I'm still alive. So I put my house in an irrevocable trust when I'm 70. And then I decided 75, hey, I'm gonna leave New York and go move to Florida. And I've had it in the trust for more than 5 years. Is there an issue with me buying another house since I transfer the ownership? And the answer is no. There's no issue. If the irrevocable trust owns my house here, the irrevocable trust will sell the house and then buy my next house. Now here's the number one mistake that we see people make in these real estate transactions. So there's a lot of stuff going on at these closings. We've seen it happen where someone will own a house in an irrevocable trust. They'll have satisfied the 5-year look back period. They sell their house and the intent is to have the trust to buy the new house. But at the closing, they make the check payable to the person, the owner. The owner then takes that check, they put it in their checking account and then deposit the money back to an account that's owned by the trust. You now have to satisfy a new 5-year look back period because you took ownership of those assets even for a second. So what you have to make sure is at that closing check should be made payable to the name of your trust, and then you immediately take that check and deposit it to either a checking account or an investment account that's owned by the trust, or you take that money and then your trust buys the next house at the next closing. Make sure it never leaves the trust. Otherwise, you voided everything you've gained in the last 5-year look back period and you have to start over again. So that's very, very important. Another question we get is, does the trust need to file a tax return? Revocable trusts do not have to file their own tax return because it's built in your social security number of the grantor or the owner. So there's no additional tax return needed. Irrevocable trusts may have to file their own tax return. If the only thing in that irrevocable trust is your primary residence, it's usually not income producing. So it has no income, so it doesn't have to file a tax return. However, as soon as you sell that house, if you sell the house and then you take the money and you put it in an investment account or you put it in a checking account and there's interest that has to be reported as taxable income, then your irrevocable trust under the tax ID will have to file its own tax return. So for those years forward, you file a tax return for yourself and your trust. So that'll be something you'll have to consider. Now, going back to a point I made earlier, our irrevocable trusts, is there any way to break them if you need to get to assets? Say there's some unforeseen event, and that's what kind of shies people away sometimes from the irrevocable, because it feels like I'm never going to be able to get these assets back. And I can tell you there's ways that the estate attorneys use to kind of get away or get around those barriers. And one of the ways is give money to an irrevocable trust. Let's just say it's sitting in an investment account now and I need to take $50,000 back, but I can't because I gave it away. What those trusts can do is they can distribute, or a lot of times gift money to the beneficiaries. So if the beneficiaries are my kids, the trust can give money to the beneficiaries and then the beneficiaries gift the money back to me. So it's just it's like a family meeting saying, hey, we're setting this irrevocable trust to really protect the assets for you guys. If we need it, they're going to gift money to you and you're going to gift it back to me. That's okay. That's kind of a workaround because essentially they're making a gift to me. I'm not just taking my asset back. The other way is the trustees of your irrevocable trust can partially revoke some of the trusts. So we could look at the trust assets and say, we're going to partially revoke $50,000 to give those assets back to mom and dad. So there's definitely workarounds that says, once you've given it, there's creative ways to kind of get those assets back if needed. So how to establish the trust? So, okay, we've gone over the benefits, everything like that. How do I actually establish one of these things? You usually need an estate attorney to establish these because a trust is an actual document and you have to outlay who's going to be the trustee, what are the terms of the trust, who are the beneficiaries. A lot of times it mimics your will because you'll have a will that says anything that's not owned by the trust is passing this way, but here's the trust document. A lot of times if everything goes to my wife and then my kids, your trust document is going to say the same thing, but you might have some additional language in there for some of that stuff for the younger children, and they only get assets at a later date. Now the other question I get is, if I have a trust, do I even need a will anymore? Usually you need both, because there's always going to be some assets that are not owned by the trust. Like a car, like registering a car in the name of a trust is kind of a headache. So there's always going to be maybe some outlier assets that are owned by your estate that essentially you're going to need the will to speak to. Otherwise, you typically try and get as much as you can in the name of the trust to avoid probate. Hope this has been helpful. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at moneysmartboard.com. Thank you.